Afternoon, gang. In an ideal world, I'd have a fancy program to put photos where I need them and all the rest of it, and give you a much sort of like animated look at London. And I'm getting recommendations in my YouTube for other channels that are much better than mine. But I'm making do for Movie Maker 10 and whatever to get by. I can't afford anything at the moment, and I'm not in the mood to spend my time looking for other programs because it's taking me hours to upload as it is. So the hope is I'm going to take you down Whitehall, so to speak. So I'm going to do it back to front this time. Audio intro, visual down it, and if I can, I'm going to put some photos either from my collection that I've accumulated since 2008, or I've been taking photos for London for longer, and then that'll be it, I suppose. So hopefully I'll pace myself, and we'll see what we can do, as I always say. And here goes nothing, Batman. Please remain seated whilst the bus is in motion, or I'll set somebody upon you. Now, effectively, Whitehall as a name originated really out of the palace that was built by Henry VIII in the 16th century, and by the time it was lost to accidental fire in 1698, it had accumulated 2,000 rooms within it. Parts of it in the late 17th century were worked on by Sir Christopher Wren, and all that's left really outside that you can see are Christopher Wren's steps behind what is Banqueting House nowadays. And indeed the front where Banqueting House is more or less all that's left of one side of it. The front of Banqueting House hasn't really changed much, other than the window where Charles I came through, and we'll come to that shortly. But Henry VIII lavished a lot upon it. It used to sit on the banks of the River Thames, so the map that you should hopefully be seeing, effectively where you see the MOD and trees, I suppose, the Thames would have been up against it. And indeed in millennia past, like in the medieval times and whatnot, the Thames was a lot wider than it is now. Successive monarchs after Henry took turns in doing stuff to Whitehall Palace, and some monarchs seemed to be less enamoured of it, others liked it. Charles I spent some money on it, and indeed the banqueting hall at the house is still got this painting on the ceiling that I forget the name of now, but it's quite awe-inspiring apparently. And then during the trial of Charles I, he was to be executed in front of it because it was sort of seen they were ending the monarchy, and the palace represented in a way some of the excesses of monarchy in the parliament's eyes anyway. So as I say, Charles was executed in front of it on the morning of 30th of January 1649, and he was led from St James's Palace, and Whitehall was full of people, the citizens and the like, and he wore two shirts so that the cold wouldn't make he wouldn't be seen shivering and therefore misinterpreted as being afraid. And for a man that had many faults, and this in a way part of the reason why this country is what it is now, Charles I think went to his death rather bravely. I mean, the game was up. The three most tumultuous days in British history had just happened for his trial, and for the only time in English and British history really, Parliament said to the King, "You're no longer needed," really, and we became a republic. But Charles was led to the scaffolding, emerged through a window from the first floor, and where that window used to be is now sort of like just plain wall above a little bust of Charles, and he lost his head, and as I say, sparked off 11 years of a republic. Now when his son, the Prince of Wales, the heir to the throne is usually titled Charles Stuart, was returned the monarchy to the country, you have your coronation ceremony a year after it, and Charles had his in 1661, and it was based at Whitehall Palace in probably one of the most well-attended and certainly most expensive and colourful coronation ceremonies in this country's history. And it was seen really as Charles's way of reminding Parliament what they just got back, what they lost, what they did to his father, but, rather than, spend money on it. And then it was destroyed by accident. A cleaning lady left candles or some such near the curtains, and the whole lot went up eventually. In a way, it probably removed from Parliament the need to spend money on something. It also moved the monarchy's base of operations to St James's Palace, where it stayed really until Queen Victoria moved to Buckingham Palace in 1837 when she took to the throne. Whitehall became the name of a road, or the road, and indeed nowadays Whitehall, if you look in your newspapers or hear it on the news, is really what they're referring to as the actual expression of government. And such is the state of British government nowadays, and for decades really. Whitehall actually spreads away from the street for a little while. I mean, it goes up as far as Horseferry Road, and you've got the Home Office out that way, and little bits and pieces. And Whitehall itself now really is not all entirely dedicated to British government. It's incredible really, but this road, back in the day, up until about, say, the 1940s and 50s, was responsible for the governments of millions of people around the world. Say what we will of the British Empire, but it all happened in a way down on this street. So if we started at the top of Whitehall, which I feel, I'm trying to think of my map, is technically north to south. Honestly, I go down it 3 times a day on the bus, but on a map, on Google Maps, it looks a little bit, the angle is out of sight, but you know what I mean. We'll start from the top. Now, the top is at Trafalgar Square in effect, but we'll start by the Charles I statue. Now, Charles' statue is meant to have been on the same spot now since 1675, and it depicts our martyred King of England, as some people refer to him. On the Sunday closest to the 30th of January, men dress up as Cavalry soldiers, those that were part of the Royalist forces, of course, and lay a wreath at his statue, and they start at St James's Park. By all accounts, it's watched by maybe a few people who are curious, but it happens every Sunday, and has done really since the death of the King, which I think is kind of incredible in more ways than one. I missed it this year. I completely forgot which part of the month I was in, and next I know the wreath, or 2 wreaths was there. But the statue was meant to have been hidden during the Republic. Somebody was told to hide it. It had been in London since the 1620s, about 1625, 26, and it was effectively hidden in somebody's garden. And next thing you know, despite the fact he was told to break it down, it re-emerged in 1660 and eventually put where it is now. It's meant to be life-size, so the King was about 4'9", something like that. He was quite a short man, maybe even 4 foot, and he's facing down Whitehall to Banqueting House. If you go down the other end of Whitehall and off Parliament Square, a tiny bust of Charles is in the back of St Margaret's Church, facing the much larger statue of Oliver Cromwell, and it's meant to be a way of keeping an eye on him or some such. Charles' statue is meant to mark the centre of the capital. So if you look on, if you do a hotel search, say in London, that's one of the best ways to do it. It will say something like 0.2 metres from Charing Cross or something. Lately, I mean, I never say it on the tour buses because A, you don't always have time to say it, and B, you don't often go, well, you sometimes go away from the script, but from the training, but they now say a lot of people that the geographic heart of the capital, because it's grown or some such, is actually in Lambeth, not too far from Lambeth North Tube Station, which is over the river, well, down and over the river from Charles. Either way, the statue hasn't moved. It's featured in Dickens novels, and the world around it has changed. It's just above where the Ministry of Silly Walks was filmed outside. James Bond's Universal Exports headquarters briefly in The Living Daylights in 1987, and that's sort of the top right. I think it's a Malaysian bank or high commission now. So if you start coming down there, we'll assume either walking or on a bus, but you have 2 stops down on Whitehall. No one ever uses stop 9 to get off anyway. And you creep yourself now past the likes of Scottish and Welsh offices, again, a fantastic representation of what changes in this country. Back in the day, we needed the Scottish office and the Welsh office because they were effectively foreign nations and miles away from London, and communication was what it was in those days. And now, we don't need it. Like, in a way, we don't need ambassadors to other countries. You can all do it on video link even before coronavirus. So they're there, and I wouldn't imagine they're the most important parts of the British government, with all due deference to either the men and women that work in them or whatever. If you carry on down, I'm just picturing it, you're going to get the old home of the Royal Navy, the Admiralty, which is just, I'm pointing like it. I'm looking at the map, you see, but effectively where you see the Horse Guards Parade, just the grey buildings above it, it's the old home of the Royal Navy in London, the Admiralty, and that was there until 1960. Now, you come past the white columns on your right hand side, and that is the front of it, and then you get a courtyard, and that's where Nelson's body was brought into in 1805 when it eventually came up from Trafalgar and then Plymouth, and it lay and stayed there, and then was taken off out the Thames to St Paul's Cathedral. In Hornblower, the books anyway, Hornblower, it commands the funeral procession on the Thames, so fictional genius. The Admiralty buildings behind the courtyard was usually where, until 1960 anyway, the First Lord of the Admiralty lived, and that's the civilian head of the Royal Navy. We don't have it anymore, and the most famous would be Winston Churchill, because he was First Lord in either World War, and didn't exactly cover himself in glory in either stint. 1915, Gallipoli, and then indeed in 1940 the Norway campaign, where a force of 3,000 Germans managed to turn the tables on a force of 10,000 Britishers. But we gave the Germans a bloody nose in their navy, and it ruined the navy for the rest of the war, but that's neither here nor there. Nowadays, the Admiralty House is effectively where politicians get to live. John Prescott did back in the day, and other people probably have that I can't think of. With Prescott, there's all manner of stories that you hear about him, but that's one of the quieter ones. Then you come on down to Horse Guards Parade. Now you see usually, and I've seen videos, like dashcam videos and that lately, it doesn't seem the guards are there since coronavirus started. But then the Horse Guards themselves are technically a temporary guard in a way, because they're only there 10 a.m, 4 p.m. daily. I think it's 11 a.m. on a Sunday. So you have the lifeguards who wear red uniforms, and you have the Blues and Wolves who wear mostly blues. Now, technically, the Blues and Wolves date back to 1960-68 now, because since the war, and certainly since things like the Napoleonic Wars and the American War of Revolution, the British Army's contracted. At the moment, our army in 2020 is actually smaller than the army we've had at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, when after the wars ended, everything from the navy down to the army was stripped of all of the men accumulated to fight Napoleon. So, like you read in the Hornblower books, all of a sudden they're out of a job, some of these people, and you do in the Jack Aubrey novels by Patrick O'Brian, for instance. Otherwise, the lifeguards are from 1660, and it seems that you had about 11 or so men protecting Charles Stuart, our future Charles II, Junior Republic, and he had to flee for his life after the disastrous Battle of Worcester in 1651, when Cromwell kicked him out of the nation for good. Well, until Cromwell died anyway, and that was technically our third civil war. They called it in the day the Third Civil War, and Charles went into exile, and the parliamentary assassins were out to get him and all this stuff. So these men protected him, and then when he restored the monarchy to the country, he made him effectively part of the British Army, and they're still with us. Despite everything. The Blues and Wolves date from the Civil War also, but officially they're from the 1960s now. Now in the morning, there will be the lifeguards in their horse boxes, say, in the pillboxes. And then at just before 11, they start switching them around. They face each other. And usually either unit replaces the other. But before the coronavirus stopped us on the buses, the lifeguards were replacing themselves because they were giving some of the chaps something to do with. since the 1840s, there are men on foot. Now, both of those both of those regiments form the Household Cavalry, the Household Division. So you have foot and horsebound soldiers. Now, the chaps on foot are usually either side of the Horse Guards. So, well, they're not in the parade ground, but they'll be at the top of the courtyard, bottom of the courtyard, in the arches, and they march back and forth sometimes. And then one of them will come out into the middle of the courtyard and through between the horses. Now, if you're in the way of these chaps, they are going to either shout at you, and then if that doesn't work, they're going to walk into you or through you. And I've seen seen both happen, because they're protecting the Queen. They're the life guard, you know. Now, the 24-hour guard, because Queen Victoria in the 1840s was coming through Horse Guards and saw one of these chaps drunk on duty. So she said for the next 99 years, 24-hour guard, and it's been more than 99 years. And that's the thing about Horse Guards. Curiously enough, it is considered their entrance to St James's Palace. So Kate, Duchess of Cambridge, when she was leaving St James's Palace to go to Westminster Abbey, you know, one of the quickest ways probably would be to go straight, you know, off the Mall, down the top of Horse Guards the parade ground, and then sort of come down past the Churchill and through Parliament Square or whatever. But she had to come through the parade ground, which you see on the map, onto Whitehall and down, and then back again after they got married. So that's why they're there in one way. And people are like, well, you know, when I've only done the Horse Guards walking tours, where we start at Trafalgar Square and I take you up the Mall and all this shit. And I've not had many people on it, but the people I've had on it are always amazed that you can get right up close to the guards if you are that inclined, and you can touch the horses. I mean, if you don't grab them, you'll be okay, because you get shouted at. And then they are amazed that you get to see them reasonably close do their thing on the parade ground, and they're like, and it's like, yeah, it's better than changing the guard, because changing the guard you're a few hundred meters away from them sometimes. And also on the return leg, when the walking tour is finished, you take into the palace, and the guards that have just finished for the day come past in front of Buckingham Palace. So you get this palace and the Queen's Guards. Whereas, yeah. So they take it very seriously. I mean, when I did my last walking tour about 3 weeks before the job ended, somebody thought it would be a good idea to sort of walk towards one of the gates, and they were shouted at, and I've never seen anyone run as fast in that week as I did then. At 4 p.m. you get a nice little dismount ceremony. The officers inspect them and then they disappear. But as I said, the good chaps on foot are always there. If you opposite the road, Crossroad even, is the old War Office. Now lately the War Office has entered Bond canon, because it's the rooftop is where Daniel Craig stood at the end of Skyfall, and the building is now being turned into a hotel. So proof that, you know, the British government is moving on, so to speak. Hopefully the hotel will keep the building's exterior as is, or at least, you know, touch up a little, but don't do anything rash to it. It's got to be a protected building. But all of these buildings are huge and right. Now you go down a little to our next stop, which is next to the Ministry of Defence. So you come in, and on your left you've got the Ministry of Defence buildings, which I usually talk about on the return leg, but as I've already taken 20 minutes just to get us this far, why not, eh? The Ministry of Defence is opened as the Air Ministry in the early 1920s, and it's now home to all of the armed forces, and you get the flags on top if you look up. The statues on our side of it are Field Marshal Slim, commander in our forces in the Far East, Field Marshal Alan Brooke, Churchill's chief of the Imperial General Staff, and Field Marshal Montgomery, commander of our forces in Western Europe back in the day. And indeed, my grandmother served under him, hence why she was at Belsen, and indeed afterwards Nuremberg for the trials. So curiously enough, we're at that stop once, and this American lady said, why do you guys have a statue of Teddy Roosevelt? And I know Teddy Roosevelt, not personally. And I looked, and I went, well, what statue are you looking at? And she was pointing at Field Marshal Slim, because his hat, it sort of curls up at the side like an Australian hat. And he's got like a similar kind of face. No idea, of course, who Field Marshal Slim was when I explained it, so... Now, the large white building on your right-hand side is the Cabinet Office, and that's where the British Cabinet, who look after this country or direct it, are usually based. Since the coronavirus, of course, they're all doing it by video link, and Boris Johnson kept sharing the images anyway of him looking at a TV screen or whatever with like 20 images. Now, how the hell, it's like the Brady Bunch on acid. There's surely a moment where Boris notices that somebody is not paying attention or is on their phone. I mean, there must be a moment where they look up and you know, he looks up and Priti Patel is doing the crossword. I'm just using the name. The Cabinet Office is linked via entrance somewhere within the building to number 10 Downing Street, the residence. Now, even on the bus, you don't get to see number 10 Downing Street. The best bet is on foot, because you can get close to the gates of the police. It depends who's on the gate. Some of the police, I don't think, care for people getting too close. But that's the thing. The gates now have been there since something like 1990 because of the Troubles. Even then, the IRA lobbed mortars from Parliament Square in it when John Major's cabinet was meeting. So he didn't, you know, the gates deter to a point, I suppose. Needless to say, Boris actually is living at number 11. I think the first Prime Minister to do that was Blair because of his family, and I suspect that Boris is living there because in a way it's a much better building. The trouble is number 10 and 11 haven't changed much exteriorly since Robert Walpole moved in the 1750s, and Churchill never was keen on it. Apparently the building used to shake something fierce during the Blitz, and it's old, cold and drafty, and it's got to be the most fortified and famous residential street on the planet, because it is still technically a street. Before the gates are in, you could realistically come right up in front of number 10. If you watch the film This Happy Breed, David Lean from 1944, they show you everyone going to see Chamberlain when he returned from Munich in 1938, and then you've got when Mrs. Thatcher came in 1979 and quoted St. Francis of Assisi. It's what it is. It's our Prime Minister's home, and one of my favourite images to do with Downing Street is I saw it first in Roy Jenkins's book about Churchill. Was when Churchill was finally leaving office in about 1953, 1954, and his health was deteriorating. He should never have been Prime Minister a second time, really. In more ways than one, physically or otherwise. He was a man of the Victorian era, with dealing with nuclear weapons. The Queen, for what I believe is the only time in her reign, maybe, and certainly I think she was the first monarch in ages, if ever, to go to Downing Street, attended a sort of like a farewell dinner at number 10 with Prince Philip, and of course Clementine Churchill was there. And Churchill never became a Lord. Must be one of the few Prime Ministers who never got bumped up to Lords, and there's a suggestion that Tony Blair will never be a Lord because of the Iraq business, or certainly the Queen's not really keen on the idea, I don't know. The corridors of power are full of careless whispers, you might say. So Churchill, they have this dinner, and he was best friends with her father. I mean, the expression BFF, I suppose, was Churchill and the King. When George VI died at the age of 56, it became tradition really after Victoria's death, is that the monarch lay in state at the Abbey, and Churchill left a wreath with the inscription that's on the for the Victoria Cross, and that's the words "for Fala," and there were tears running down his cheeks. So Churchill opens the door for the Queen, and he bows to her wearing his, Order of the Garter or whatever it is, and the Queen's smiling. And it's an incredible image, because until Boris Johnson, no Prime Minister ever bowed with such deference to the monarch as Winston Churchill. And for all the faults of the man, monarchy and him were like that. He had a 17th century attitude in some respects, which they say Prince Charles does. And if I'm not mistaken, Prince Charles, when he was about 5 or 6, sat on Winston Churchill's lap as a boy. So you carry on down from number 10, and you're now in the heart of British government, really. I mean, all the fun stuff is up towards Charles I, your pubs, your theatre, there's 4 pubs at least, and then your gift shops and that. And towards this end, the rest of it's sort of hidden by the remodelled Westminster Tube Station. There's a little Boots, Cafe Nero, that sort of thing, and a parliamentary gift shop if you ever want your your House of Lords bath towels, say. The last of the large white buildings is just past the arch of King Charles Street, and that's the old ministry, the Treasury, and I believe it is home to the FCO, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, as it's known now, the FO back in the day, and the rooftop of the Treasury building. Right down on the corner, where the arrow on my map there ends, Churchill would have stood on the rooftop to watch the bombers come over. They say he was up there when the Germans bombed Coventry, and you think, well, the Blitz was bad, and you probably would have seen the flames from Coventry. I mean, the flames from London were seen now High Wycombe, just up the road where I was born, and that's about 30 odd miles, 20 miles maybe, from London. But you see, in those days, the Enigma breakthrough, that is, the coded messages Germany had, was broken by the Poles. We've got to give them the credit, in 1939. And so they say Churchill had, of course, Ultra, as it was known, was top secret all the way through to the 1980s. And there are still people alive today from Station X who will not talk about it, even though they can officially nowadays. Ultra revealed that the Germans were going to go off and bomb Coventry, and the story is that Churchill was told about this, and they could have warned Coventry about, get people ready, because at the time Germany was still focused on London, really. I mean, they were bombing other, Portsmouth was bombed quite a lot before London started to take it, because it's the home of the Royal Navy, but London was really the target in October 1940, and they hit Coventry and hit it hard. The Germans called it Coventratun, at least Joseph Goebbels did. The British called it Coventrated. It was awful, and Churchill stood on the rooftop. Possibly, I think, out of some kind of conscience. It sounds curious me saying that, I guess, but he did care for his people. As I say, he wasn't perfect, and I'm not going to defend him on other things. But it sounds like he went to the roof to maintain the illusion of the fact that they were coming for London, and they didn't. And I don't know. I think the war is multifaceted. And on that note, you reach the end of before we reach the end of Whitehall, what sits underneath the old treasures, of course, Winston Churchill's War Rooms. Now, they were actually built for Neville Chamberlain's government in 1938, and that's where Chamberlain famously intoned that we were at war with Germany on September 3rd, 1939. And my late Nan, God bless her, she was about, I think she was 15 at the time, and her dog died that day, and she said to us a couple of years before she died that she was more upset about her dog dying than the war. I mean, she was a child, really. Chamberlain again has his critics. I mean, if you watch The Darkest Hour, you see on film how the Conservative Party do backstabbing, and they do it better than anyone else. But Chamberlain actually, is an untouted hero in a way, because during his premiership in 1939, he signed off on excess orders, or at least more than we were building at the time, Spitfires and Hurricanes. And so they were, by the time that order was fulfilled in that, the Battle of Britain had started. And if that hadn't been the case, well, I wouldn't say we would have lost the Battle of Britain, but we would have been hard pressed as a nation. The war rooms are fascinating. It's where British history and world history was made. It's where Britain decided it was going to fight on in 1940. It's where we said we weren't going to make peace with a man who had just rolled up Europe in 2 weeks. Churchill, I think, would be tickled to know it's open to the public, see people buying bath towels, dining room mats, plates, whatever, with his image on it. And it's in, I haven't done it for years. I think I did it last when I was volunteered at the Imperial War Museum, so I got in for free. It's now more or less known as the Churchill Museum. So there's that. And on the corner and Whitehall could have been where Winston Churchill died had the Germans invaded in 1940. Now obviously it didn't happen. I was told at uni counterfactual history is not relevant, but it can shine a light on the world you're heading into, like Robert Harris's book Fatherland about Germany winning the war set in 1964 is effectively sort of like some kind of commentary in a way on the European Union and things like that. And his Cicero trilogy is seen as a comment on the American empire, as Niall Ferguson and others have referred to it after, say, 2001. So Britain made preparations for invasion, as I think I've said in some video, and there was a newspaper stand on the corner of Parliament Square and the old Westminster Tube Station before its 99 remodelling, and it was actually mostly a machine gun post. It was meant to be apparently for any Germans that came up with, and in my humblest opinion, even if they had the means to do so, I think the Germans would have been quite lucky if they hadn't if they hadn't been on foot if the tanks weren't in London, say, to get up river without being blown out the water, because the Thames is like the Death Star trench. It should be very easy to defend, I would have thought. Or maybe maybe we would have blown up bridges. Who knows? So, I've read a few books that theorise on it. Churchill could have died on Downing Street. He could have died out Parliament Square. You think to yourself, well, this is not what I'm paying for. But people sometimes are seem fascinated by what I've just said, because he was prepared to go. I mean, when, like you see in Darkest Hour, when he spoke to the outer cabinet and he said, effectively, we're going to keep going until we drown in each other's blood. Yeah, it's a classic Churchillian drama, but he meant it, and it helped him seal his party's backing. And then, of course, we shelled the French fleet around, and that underlined our commitment to the war, but also ruined French relations to this day. The war was the war, but Churchill would have gone down fighting. I think he would have seen the king off, and that's the king would have had to be evacuated to Canada, and it's a romantic image. Somehow I always picture it with a cigar in mouth, and that's how I have Churchill die in my alternate history book. He loved his wife. She must have been the most patient woman in British history, but he loved his country as well, and not more than his wife, but that's it. So that takes you down Whitehall. That's half an hour of my life I've just given you. It doesn't take half an hour to come down on the bus, trust me, even if the bus driver stopped. It's what it is. That brings you, though, I'm not going to take you over Westminster Bridge, the home of the British government, Churchill's favourite battleground, the Houses of Parliament. And the current parliamentary buildings date from the 1860s and 70s. Fire wiped out the medieval home in 1834, and the only part of the medieval buildings left is what you see when we come around the corner, and that's Westminster Hall from 1097, built by King William Rufus, aka William II, and that's where Charles I was placed on trial, and that's where Anne Boleyn was placed on trial. Henry II and many, many others, not necessarily members of the royal family, were all the way until the Royal Courts of Justice opened in 1868. So there you go. Hopefully I've covered everything for a change. I've developed 5-second memory loss, so on that note,